Today, we're going to discuss 9 steps that you can take to get yourself out of contracting purgatory and dramatically reduce the time you spend in contract negotiations and the money or time you're investing with commercial lawyers. I'm joined today by our subject matter expert, Karin, a lawyer who's spent over 20 years working around sales agreements on both sides of the table, both in-house counsel and as a law firm lawyer. Over the years, she's uncovered how to improve redlining, close deals faster. So if you're involved in complex sales in any way, be it as an account executive, a deal desk team member, or maybe as a sponsoring executive, the insights in this conversation are going to make your life much better. Karin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
All right. So, Karin, you've helped simplify this really complex topic by creating a 9-step framework. So let's start by talking about the start. Step 1 is start early. I'm keen to know, tell me more.
Well, one thing I should note is I've also been a tech startup CEO. So I have a little bit of background on product development as well. And I think, when you're getting advice from your advisors, that a lot of times we think about product fit and market fit, but we don't necessarily think about what are the hurdles that I'm going to face when I actually try to sell my product. In other words, what is the buyer's legal team going to give me pressure on, right? So things like, what does my product, especially if you're a SaaS company, what kind of data do you handle? And what kind of risk does using your product present to the buyer? So thinking about those things in terms of both product development, how can I mitigate the risk in my product itself? And then also, how can I insulate the risk through things like insurance, encryption and security and data privacy policies and that sort of thing. And that should really start at the very beginning in your product development, your business model.
It's really interesting when you put it like that. It's essentially part of the feature design process. And I don't think I've ever come across anybody thinking about it like that, which makes total sense. In particular, as you're thinking about the ideal customer profile, who you're segmenting, they've got a whole bunch of different expectations, right? If you're thinking about mitigating risk for enterprise, then, SOC 2 compliance and all that other stuff that maybe the smaller companies don't think about, but just not part of the equation.
Right.
Yeah.
And SOC 2 compliance in particular, I do think you'll see enterprise customers know that that's a really expensive and long process and probably a very heavy lift for an early stage company. And so they're going to be willing to kind of pass on that, but they're going to want to know that it's on the map somewhere in the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It makes me think back to very early days at Salesforce when I was there. There were some unintended uses of the platform. For example, it came to our attention that people were storing PII and things like financially sensitive data, like credit cards, were being stored in there, and we weren't hashing the data, right? So that was something that we didn't anticipate. Which, to your point, right, thinking about product roadmap direction would help you get ahead of that, right?
Absolutely, yes. And then, of course, your contract agreement can mitigate that kind of risk for you, right? That your user imposed risk. So if you have fields where you can put any kind of data in there, you can contract around that risk for yourself as well.
Perfect. Well, that makes sense. So why don't we talk about the actual process itself? And in step 2, you say stack the process. Now, I live in Las Vegas, and so I'm all about stacking things in my favor. What do you mean by that? What's stack the process?
Yeah, so stacking the processes is, in an enterprise deal, there are a number of stakeholders, right? You usually start out with a user team and they get really excited about your product. And quite honestly, sometimes the user team doesn't even really understand what I would call the procurement process from the enterprise side. Mm-hmm. But it really kind of has 4 distinct buckets, and that would be the user team and getting the user team excited about your product. Then the user team typically pulls in procurement, and procurement is really interested in things that are more what I would call deal specific, things like how many users and how much storage or whatever the license parameters might be. And of course, price, right? Like that's the big one for procurement. And so and then there's typically the security risk team, right? They want to go and look at your tool and make sure that the risk is minimized as much as possible. And then you get to legal. So instead of going through each of those processes, we really encourage our sellers to stack them as much as possible. So obviously you're not going to go to the user team and say, let's get procurement involved on day one. But when you start to feel like this is going beyond just kind of like a casual date and it's getting a little bit more serious, then you can say, hey, what does the rest of the process consist of? Can we get those things kicked off? And the legal and the risk assessment, those parts of the process tend to be the longer parts of the process. So if you can get them going in tandem, then you're reducing the entire redlining cycle or the entire selling cycle, if you will. So that's the goal. Yeah, sometimes you're going to have a hard time getting a buyer to cooperate with you, but to the degree that you can trigger those processes, it's best to do it as early as possible.
I agree. And one of the practical, tactical things that you and I both know is that, look, legal have got 100 competing priorities. They're not going to want to get involved until they know the business has made a decision that they want to move forward, right? But notwithstanding, it sort of comes back to great enterprise and complex sales process where you want to be connected to a great executive sponsor on the customer side such that they can decide, they can make the call early and say, hey, legal, procurement, now's the time, right? Yes. I want you involved. And if you just work with the user team without executive sponsorship, it's going to be much harder because they don't have the internal clout to get those resources, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So in step 3, you talk about summarizing terms in order to speed things up. So what do you mean? How should folks do that?
Right. So, when a lot of the SaaS companies, some of the SaaS companies, of course, are bootstrapped, but a lot of them receive outside funding, right? And you don't receive outside funding until you get a term sheet, right? Summary of terms. We actually encourage the same thing. And so there are 2 ways you can do this. You can just kind of summarize your terms and present your pricing at the same time. And I've seen it happen where sellers propose pricing and they get way into the contracting process and they find out, oh, I have to carry $5 million worth of professional liability insurance. Well, there goes my margin, right? And so we say it's like, just do a summary of your terms and predicate your pricing on those terms. And then that way, we have to renegotiate pricing conversation is a little less uncomfortable because you've made your pricing conditioned on substantial compliance with the terms that you've proposed in your summary.
A critical point that most, I think, earlier in their career enterprise sales folks don't think about. Price and terms are inextricably connected because if I'm going to trade risk for price, then I need to do a balancing act, right? Less risk for me, more discount for you.
Right.
So I think it's really good advice, and something I've seen work really well is for the internal legal team to create sort of a cheat sheet for all those key terms. They get presented with a sort of top end range of your price, such that when they start negotiating with us, we can combine the 2 conversations. Because to your point, I quite commonly see people getting driven to their bottom end of their price range, and then discussion around terms comes in.
Absolutely. And another thing is, if you feel like you're going to, or your buyer is going to demand that you work from their paper, then ask for a copy of their paper and understand, of course, that their paper is going to reflect worst case scenario. In other words, the riskiest software they could buy. And that's at least a starting point, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. It makes it's an interesting balancing act to invite it, but to your point, if you think it's inevitable, if you're selling to Microsoft or someone like that, you know what's going to happen, so you may as well get ahead of it.
Exactly.
So at this point, we're coming into contact with lawyers, and when I talk to procurement or legal people, most people have an allergic reaction. Right? But the reality is, legal team can help you if you help them. Right? It's really tough. In-house counsel, you've got this big pipeline of stuff where everyone wants your resources. And step 4 is really interesting to me. It says knowing who you're dealing with. And in my experience, most sales teams try to understand the buying unit, but neglect to realize that legal is critical. So what advice do you have?
Well, we actually have a legal persona that we're happy to hand out that kind of explains what the person, generally, not the specific person, obviously, but the kind of persona that you would be dealing with, and understand that in an enterprise organization, and I hate to say it, but the lawyer really doesn't care whether the deal gets done or not, except that she cares that she is satisfying her in-house clients, right? So, but other than that, she doesn't have a vested interest in the deal at all. And her real motivation is just to get it off her desk, because she spends all day triaging, right? She's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these deals coming across her desk. So when you know that the lawyer is triaging, and you know that the best way to get your deal at the top of the stack is to be super cooperative, to be providing value in the same way that you would be providing value to your user team, right? Like, how can I help you get this deal done? And facilitating, if she has questions, get the answers for her. Make sure you are not directing the review, but facilitating the review. And I've been on the other side of transactions where I've literally been called at home at 9 o'clock on a Friday evening, and I'm telling you, I know you want to close the deal, but that is the worst thing somebody could possibly do, to ingratiate themselves to the other side. So it really is about understanding and empathy, and knowing, how can I facilitate the transaction? How can I make her job easier on this particular transaction?
Yeah, 100%. And so I think, coming back to your early point about sharing the summary of your terms early, it's an opportunity for early engagement with legal on the other side to kind of get their reaction, their response, and what their summary of needs would be, right? So you can have an early engagement. I think what I see most often is we're not considering that at all. It's like,
right,
here's our position, and we're going to defend. Our job is to defend that, as opposed to, we're both trying to get a deal done here. So
right.
Let's bring the two together. So yeah, 100%. And I think related to that, step 5, where you point out that contracting itself is still part of the sales process. And it's not sort of some rubber stamp thing, or worse still, what most people do is they think about it, that's the time when I flick this red line contract over the fence to legal. So what's your advice here?
Well, my advice is that it is part of the sales process, and really the sale is never closed until you have your seller's ink on your contract, right? So I think it's really important to stay engaged, and again, facilitate the transaction, and to recognize that by tossing it over the fence to someone else, you are really relinquishing control, and you're relinquishing control to people who don't have quite the vested interest in the deal that you do. And so again, like, staying involved and making sure you're facilitating the transaction as best you can. That's the critical thing.
Makes total sense. So it feels like we're on the right track here. Is there an interesting analog in contracting, I think, where discovery is like a critical aspect of sales process, right at the beginning? And I say that to build a deal is a bit like building a house. There's like nothing you do later on, like painting the damn thing or putting a roof on, matters if you don't invest in a solid foundation. And so what's the foundation that you refer to in step 6 that's the number one red lines destroyer?
The number one red lines destroyer is having good paper in the first place, right? So a lot of the challenge is that I told you the buyers, I'm going to constantly do that, mix buyer and seller all the time, but the buyer's paper always worst case scenario, right? So you've already got somebody that's not close to the finish line. And then oftentimes what happens with sellers, especially if they're early stage, is they borrow their contract from a buddy, or they get it off the internet, or they have it done by a lawyer who's giving them a great document in terms of protecting the company, but that's not necessarily a market-driven agreement. It's not driven to close the deal, because I think, and I've been this lawyer, right? I've been the law firm lawyer that wrote the SaaS agreement for my customer without thinking about who are they selling to, what are the sellers going to demand, and most law firm lawyers don't have that volume experience so that they know what the market requires. So the number one red line destroyer is having good paper. It's easy to read, and I mean it's easy to read by a layperson, right? Like it's your sales guy should absolutely understand it. It should be no mystery. We remove as much Latin as possible. We are active voice. It's easily read. It's simply organized, and it's just kind of plain English document so that people can get through it. I mean, even lawyers have a hard time getting through documents, right? They're full of prepositional phrases and Latin, and so it's just really simplified. It's user friendly, and then and it's also market driven. It's driven based on your product, the risk imposed by your product, the kind of data you're handling, and the kind of risk that might be associated with working with a company in your life cycle.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know what happened to it. Maybe you can reflect on this briefly, a tangent conversation. In the 90s, there was a movement for plain English language contracting. And I remember distinctly reading for the first time a document that said things literally like, if you do not pay us on the date we agreed, we will charge you 1% interest per day. Now, if you put that into the terms that's normally included in a contract, you wouldn't know what the hell was. I mean, what happened to that, Karin? Is that still a thing, plain English contracts, or did it fade away because no one was making enough money interpreting contracts?
I think it is still a thing. I do hear it spoken. You hear it talked about among lawyers, a small segment of lawyers, I would say. I think part of the challenge is that we're creatures of habit, and it's a little bit of a heavy lift to take documents that are written in a particular way and simplify them in a way that's easy to understand. Because, as I said, we're creatures of habit. We're used to reading things a certain way. And I do think there's a little bit of professional protectionism, if you will, that, if I make this too easy, who needs me?
I think so. I think there might be a little bit of that, but I think this sort of segues beautifully into Rule 7, which might intimidate a few people. And it says, become a student of contracts. And as it happens, I actually did a year of commercial law at university, which made me, dangerous because I didn't know what I was talking about, but I could spell it. And I made a point of really understanding all the master subscription agreements that I ever had to negotiate. Like I really wanted to know clause by clause, like what does this mean and why do we have to defend it? I thought I was an outlier. So how do you think about it, and how deep should sellers and other executives related to deals go on this?
Right. Well, you might have been an outlier. I do believe that people tend to know enough to be dangerous, and we really advise that you know enough to be protected, right? So you don't have to be a student of all contracts, but you should be a student of your contract. And you should be a student of the kinds of provisions that a buyer will require you to put in your contract. They should already be there if you have a market-driven contract, but there are also going to be outliers in terms of seller expectations, right? You're going to get one wacky seller that wants something crazy. And you should know, how do I deal with this, or understand the legal implication behind indemnification, for example. Once you understand the legal implication, everything is a business decision. You don't need a lawyer, right? You don't need a lawyer. You just need to understand the legal implication, the risk associated with the provision, know what your risk profile is. Like, is this something I can swallow or not? And then you can make a business decision based on that risk and risk analysis.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because there's a very big difference between drafting language and drafting intent, right? The business decision, which is the intent, can be done without lawyers, right? And when it comes to figuring out how we capture that, then sure, you need a legal professional in most cases. But most people miss that, and they are asking legal professionals to make business-based judgment decisions, which is wrong, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So look, when we put together our show notes, I thought step 7, which was just completed, it was pretty much it. We're done. But there are 2 more, as you put it, critical, I think, follow-on steps relating to relevance, currency, and really competitiveness in terms of our contract creation. So could you perhaps roll together for us steps 8 and 9, tell people what they are and what it means?
I have to look to remember what 8 and 9 are. But
we're going to talk about auditing, revising, and repeating.
Right, auditing, revising, and then reviewing. Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is, as you're doing your contracts, right? When you sign the contracts, you should review them to make sure that to identify where you're moving off your templates. So if you generally say, I'm going to carry $3,000 worth of professional liability insurance, and a buyer requires you to carry 5, and
Right.
you agree to that. Okay, that is a variation that you should track. Right. So how often are we moving off our standard terms? Because that's really giving you institutional knowledge about how your agreements, or how and whether your agreements are market driven, right? And the market changes. So what you can be doing is tracking these movements off your standard terms and identifying trends in the marketplace as they relate specifically to your product. So that's review, and then an audit is the same thing, right? And do it, and then decide, we're moving off this standard provision almost 90% of the time. Clearly, we need to change our standard provision to reflect what we are actually agreeing to. Because every time you have a provision, every time you present a provision to a seller and you change it, like that's friction, right? That's friction in the process. And so if you're measuring, where is this friction arising? That's really what the audit is about, right? Where is this friction arising? And how can I reduce that friction so that we close our deals faster and we can get closer to a one-turn redlining process? Because that's really the goal. Really, the goal is to reduce the redlining process, which adds somewhere between 9 and 21 weeks to the sales cycle.
Right. And frankly, I think in very practical terms, the people who are going to care most about this are actually the legal professionals who are seeing the same variations every time. They're probably best placed to create a register of the variations. Would you agree? Because I just don't see sales organizations paying any attention to it, frankly. They're just, you know what I mean? It's someone else's problem. I think, whether they should or not.
So I guess I would say this is an operational thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure that this is necessarily the work of a lawyer, and I don't actually think it's an efficient use of legal resources. So I think you can track this kind of stuff, and you could track it with somebody who's a data entry person. You just have to be able to look at, where are the variations? Does it make sense that I make? That's probably not a data entry analysis. That's analysis is probably done by a higher level. But
certainly in big companies, deal desk, BizOps, that sign all contracts, that's probably an easy answer for larger organizations, right?
Probably.
It's for the very, very small startups where it'll be interesting to see who's going to put their hand up for that. But makes total sense. And I think related to that is step 9 about looking at unique obligations.
Yes.
And the example you gave me was, and I like this a lot, where notifications or notices to a specific email address when certain event, that really exposes to. So, how should folks think about this? What should they avoid or look for?
Right. Well, I think the example of an email address is a good one. I think you need to first off, before you agree to something like this, you need to check it with your ops team, right? Is this something that we can do? How hard would it be? How do we do it, right? And some of the stuff is easy. A different notification email might mean you have a different Zap set up, or you put a new email address in your CRM or whatever it might be. But really, after you close the agreement, so first check with your ops team to make sure that they can implement the changes that are being asked. And then secondly, after the agreement is signed, make sure that the changes are implemented, right? So if you have operational requirements that come out of the agreement, that you implement those changes so that you're not automatically in breach.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. It's interesting. One of the ones that used to come up for me a lot was notification of downtime, which was always a controversial one, right? It's like, right. So if the system goes down for more than X period, you must tell the buyer that this has happened. And of course, there's usually associated penalties. And our counter argument, which always used to make me smile, was, well, look, if you didn't notice, it didn't matter. So why should we have to tell you? But anyway, that's a debate and discussion for another time. But Karin, this has been very high on tactics per minute, is how I like to measure these sorts of shows. And I'm sure that some folks listening will want to get some support on their journey, which is what 22 does, your organization. Right. So how will someone know whether you can help them on the way, and how should they get in touch? Of course, we'll have your contact details and show notes wherever people are viewing or listening to this.
Okay. So the first thing I want to make really clear is that 22 is not a law firm. We are a business organization. We consult on the redlining operations. And we have an affiliate who is a law firm. So if you have legal issues that come up that can only be answered by a lawyer, we do have those resources. But our belief very strongly is that you don't need a lawyer, and that using a lawyer to do this kind of work, it's really operational work. It is an expensive way to spend your legal resources. So the first thing I would say is, anytime someone is coming up and having a challenge with an enterprise buyer and they need to kind of noodle through the challenge, I'd be more than happy to take a call and help somebody think through that challenge, and I do that off the clock. So that's just something I'm willing to help people with. But when it comes to using our services, I think our services and our products and services are triggered in like 3 different instances. One is like, if you're just starting to sell enterprise and you want to kick this off right, I would say you need a good portfolio of contracts. And that's the NDA, it's the summary of terms or the term sheet, it's the evaluation agreement, it's everything that's going to help you close a customer. And we can help you with those tools. We can help you with DIY tools, right? So if you're finding that you've been doing your enterprise agreements for a while and you're really kind of like, here we go, the redlining process, and you want to figure out how to make that shorter, we can come in and we can analyze where the friction is, help you figure out how to reduce the friction. Again, give you market-driven documents based on your own history. We give you a playbook by which you can do your own contract negotiation so you don't have to outsource it to an expensive lawyer. And then the third place I think where someone could really utilize our services is they're finding the DIY process is not an efficient use of their sales team's time. And we offer contract review services. So we typically do that on a flat fee, volume-based, almost subscription basis. And we assign a dedicated resource based on our customer's risk profile. So if they're more comfortable working with an attorney, we can assign them to an attorney through our affiliate company, or we get contract review specialists, we get paralegals who do it at a lesser cost, and then we follow your agreement, your playbook, your processes. It's really just outsourcing that legal-ish operations, which again, I say legal-ish because we believe they're business.
Yeah, I really like that. And again, I'm going to come back to the language of deal desk. So a lot of you scaling organizations will have some form of deal desk, which is typically focused on discounting practices. And more often than not, you won't have that internal expertise around contract term review ahead of getting outside to external counsel. So I think folks should think about that. If you don't have the ability to do that right now, this is a perfect solution to bridge you through to the next phase where you might have access to more resources. Karin, this has been great. Super valuable for everybody listening, I know. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Bye for now.
Take care.